What if the most powerful thing you could do this election season isn't actually casting a ballot, but refusing to take part at all? Just imagine for a second an election where they announce a winner, but the silence from empty polling stations is absolutely deafening. A surprising number of Americans already feel like their voice just doesn't count in politics. So, is it possible that real power isn't in playing a game that many see as broken, but in everyone agreeing not to play? We're going to explore a really controversial idea. What if people staged a full-blown voting boycott as a massive protest? Now, this isn't about not caring. It's about a deliberate no, born from some deep, serious frustrations with the American electoral system. For years, polls have shown this unsettling trend. A big chunk of Americans, sometimes almost a third, feel totally cut off from politics. This isn't some fringe idea. It's something you hear from Republicans, independents, and Democrats alike, and you can almost feel this frustration. Around 7 out of 10 Americans say they're fed up with presidential campaigns. Lots of Americans look at their ballots and feel like the outcome is already decided, that there's no real choice. A big reason for this? Gerrymandering. That's where politicians draw electoral maps to keep themselves in power, basically picking their voters before voters even get a chance to pick them. Take 2024, for example. The Cook political report said only a tiny number of U.S. House seats were actually up for grabs. And then there's the stranglehold of the two-party system. America's full of diverse interests and political views, but we're mostly stuck with just two major parties. Polls keep showing that most Americans would love a third major party, but the system makes it incredibly tough for any alternative to get any real footing. Making it all worse is the massive influence of money in politics. People argue about whether money flat out buys elections every time, but the fact that it's everywhere makes people feel like the system is rigged for rich donors and special interests. Many feel like voting just puts a stamp of approval on a system that isn't really working for them. These frustrations aren't just about how things are set up now. They're also tangled up in a long, messy history of voter suppression and people being denied their rights. For centuries, huge parts of the American population were systematically kept from voting because of their race, gender, or whether they owned property. Big laws like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 tried to tear down these walls, but that progress is under attack, and new ways of keeping people out keep popping up. The U.S. still has this jumbled, often confusing mix of voting laws that can hit minority communities, the poor, and young people a lot harder. We see it in strict voter ID laws, rules about felons voting that affect millions, super long lines at polling stations in certain areas, frequent cleaning out of voter rolls, and limits on voting by mail. These aren't just abstract problems. They're real obstacles that can make the simple act of voting a major challenge for many. Research clearly shows these tactics often target Black and other marginalized communities. Things like the recently talked about Project 2025 Inches suggest these efforts could get even worse. Ideas in that plan look to criminalize simple voting mistakes, give the federal government more power to aggressively purge state voter rolls, and weaken the protections we already have for voting rights. Critics say these moves are meant to scare voters and election workers, limit access, and unfairly affect marginalized groups. When communities keep running into roadblocks just to make their voices heard, it's no wonder they get disillusioned and start to feel like the system is fundamentally unfair. That can push some to ask if it's even worth participating in that system at all. This isn't about a few isolated incidents. It's a pattern that wears down trust and feeds the idea that the game is rigged. Beyond how voting works and the history behind it, there's this widespread feeling that the political system overall just isn't listening to regular folks. A lot of Americans, nearly a third according to some studies, feel politically alienated. They think their voice doesn't matter, no matter who's in charge. This isn't just about disagreeing on policies. It's a deeper feeling that politicians are out of touch, more wrapped up in party squabbles than in solving real problems. Pew Research Center findings from 2023 don't paint a pretty picture. Only 4% of U.S. adults say the political system is working extremely or very well, and a whopping 63% have little to no confidence in its future. Elected officials? Most people see them as self-serving, and it's not just a feeling. Studies show majorities of Americans don't trust politicians to put the country's interests before their parties. This feeling of being ignored gets even worse with all the partisan gridlock. and the sense that government is run by special interests and campaign money. When people see urgent problems go unsolved, or watch policies get passed that seem to help only a few instead of the general public, their faith in the power of their vote starts to fade. The feeling is, even when they vote, even when they pick their representatives, the system itself is too broken, too tied to powerful forces to bring about any real change. This deep-seated political alienation can lead to a logical, if pretty radical, question. If the system doesn't listen when we vote, would it listen if a whole lot of us just refuse to? So, if the system feels rigged, unresponsive, and historically stacked against fair representation, what power does one person really have? This brings us to the pretty bold idea of a voting boycott as a deliberate act of protest. The thinking behind a voting boycott, in this light, isn't about giving up or not caring. It's framed as a conscious, strategic way of saying, we don't consent to this. Supporters might say that taking part in a system you see as fundamentally unfair or illegitimate just helps to prop that system up. By refusing to vote, a large enough group of citizens could, theoretically, send a powerful message of no confidence. The aim wouldn't be to just sit it out, but to create a legitimacy crisis for elected officials and the whole voting process. An election with dramatically low turnout, especially if it was because of an organized boycott, could really make people question the authority of whoever wins. Historically, boycotts have been used to push for change in all sorts of situations. The Montgomery bus boycott during the Civil Rights Movement and the international boycotts against apartheid South Africa are often brought up as strong examples where people collectively refusing to participate in an unjust system helped bring about major societal shifts. While these weren't election boycotts, they show the potential power of organized non-participation as a way to fight injustice. Some argue that when all other ways to bring about change seem blocked, a boycott can be a powerful tool to shake things up and force a conversation about serious reform. It's a way of saying, this system is so broken, we refuse to validate it by participating until real changes are made. Now, we absolutely have to look at the strong arguments against not voting. The most common one, and it's a deeply felt one, is that staying home means handing power over to those whose policies you don't want. If you don't vote, you're letting the other side win, is something we hear all the time. Many also bring up the hard-fought battles for the right to vote, stressing that voting is a civic duty and a right people sacrificed for. These are valid and powerful points. Studies on election boycotts in other countries suggest they often end up being disastrous for the boycotting group and can actually help the ruling power dig in even deeper. The argument is simple. You can't win if you don't play, and dropping out often leads to being sidelined, not gaining influence. But supporters of a protest boycott might flip this around and ask, what if those arguments assume we have a system that's fundamentally fair and responsive in the first place? What if, in a deeply flawed system, the act of voting itself just puts a thin democratic shine on things without leading to any real accountability or change? If the choices are always uninspiring, if the results feel decided by things like gerrymandering or big money, and if elected officials seem unresponsive, no matter who wins, some start to wonder if their vote is truly an exercise of power or just a symbolic gesture that props up a broken structure. The point isn't necessarily that voting is never useful, but that in a system seen as deeply compromised, a mass refusal to participate might be the only way to force a real look at its fundamental flaws. It moves the protest from inside the system to a protest against the system itself. While individuals staying home out of apathy might not achieve much, a collective strategic boycott is aiming for a completely different kind of impact. So what would a widespread voting boycott in America actually do? Or what could it risk? It's a path full of unknowns. On one hand, a big drop in turnout, publicly declared as a protest, could definitely shake up the political establishment. It could dominate the news, forcing a national conversation about the deep-seated issues we've talked about: gerrymandering, campaign finance, voter suppression, and political alienation. It might push political parties and institutions to think more seriously about reforms, afraid of a real crisis of legitimacy if huge numbers of people openly say the system isn't representative. If enough people opt out, it could theoretically make election results look hollow, maybe even spark a discussion about the very structure of American democracy. However, the risks are undeniably huge. As historical looks at election boycotts show, they can backfire, big time. Instead of forcing reform, A boycott could just lead to the election of candidates favored by the remaining, maybe more extreme, voters. That could make the very problems the boycotters wanted to protest even worse. It could further push aside already underrepresented communities if their voting rates drop more than others. There's also the argument that low turnout can tilt democracy towards the interests of a smaller, often more privileged group of people. The system, however flawed, might just keep chugging along, with those in power brushing off the boycott as apathy or a fringe movement instead of a legitimate protest. There's no guarantee a boycott would be seen as a demand for systemic change rather than just giving up civic responsibility. This isn't a call to action to boycott, but an exploration of a powerful idea born from widespread frustration. The very fact that such a radical idea as a mass voting boycott is even on the table points to a serious crisis of faith in the American electoral process. It suggests that for many, the usual ways of making their political views known feel like they're not enough to tackle the huge problems they see. Thinking about a boycott comes from fundamental questions about power, representation, and the very health of our democracy. It forces us to face uncomfortable truths about who the system truly serves and whether it's capable of fixing itself. So the lingering question isn't just whether you should or shouldn't vote. It's much deeper. In a system where so many feel voiceless, where the rules often seem rigged, and where trust in political institutions is at rock bottom, what is the most powerful statement an individual or a whole group can make? Is it by participating, hoping to change the system from within, or is it by withdrawing consent, hoping to force a more fundamental reevaluation? What will it ultimately take for the calls for deep, structural change to be not just heard, but actually acted upon your vote or your refusal to give it?